the young nurse from Glenwood City, Wisconsin, 24 years old, more than a year overseas, gathering her colleagues in the ruins of coastal Italy and leading them in song. For the soldiers, for the boys she would go on caring for, right up to the last moment. Her name was Ellen Ainsworth. She was wearing her Red Cross armband when the shell hit. It was supposed to protect her. That was the agreement. That was the law. That was the entire reason the armband existed. A universal signal, recognized by every army, every government, every signatory to the Geneva Conventions. Do not fire. Do not touch. She is not a combatant. The armband was painted on the tent above her too, 20 feet wide, impossible to miss, and that they shelled her anyway. This is the story of the nurses of the 56th Evacuation Hospital at Anzio, 6 of whom were killed by enemy fire in the winter and spring of 1944. It is a story about what it means to hold a post that is supposed to be protected, what it means when protection fails, and what it means when an institution that sends women into a war zone quietly considers, in the middle of that war zone, whether to abandon them. It is also one of the least told stories of the Second World War. This video is here to change that. January 22nd, 1944. Allied forces came ashore at Anzio, a coastal resort town 33 miles south of Rome. The operation was called Shingle. The plan was elegant. Land behind the German lines, threaten Rome from the rear, force the enemy to split its forces, and break the Italian stalemate that had been grinding since the previous summer. It was Winston Churchill's idea. He had championed it as a bold stroke, a wildcat let loose behind enemy lines. What he would later write of it, with bitter honesty, told a different story. I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale. What happened was a siege. The Germans recovered from their initial surprise with remarkable speed. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring pulled every available unit into a tight defensive ring around the beachhead. His artillery was positioned in the Alban Hills, high ground with a clear line of sight over every inch of the Allied position. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The sea was at the Allies' backs, and the hills were German. For 4 months, rain fell on the beachhead, and then rain fell on the shells. The front lines were less than 10 miles from the shore. The hospitals had been placed in flat, open ground near the town of Nettuno. Canvas tents, wooden frames, marked with enormous red crosses on white circles. The international symbol that is supposed to end the conversation before it begins. The troops had a name for the place where the hospital sat. They called it HELLS'S ACRE. The nurses of the 56th Evacuation Hospital arrived at Anzio in late January 1944, days after the initial landing. They had not come straight from home. These were not fresh recruits. They had already served in Morocco, in Tunisia, at Salerno. They had followed the war up the boot of Italy, tent by tent, patient by patient, arriving at each new theatre already hardened by the one before. By the time they reached Anzio, and they had been overseas for well over a year, they learned the Anzio shuffle, a duck walk to stay low and avoid shell fragments. They leapt into slit trenches half full of water during air raids. They lived and often slept with their helmets on, and they cared for their patients, performing surgery while bombs fell. In its first 36 hours operating at Anzio, the 56th received 1,129 patients, and it became a hub of the American hospital network on the beachhead, routinely operating under intense pressure. The khaki hospital tents were marked by enormous red crosses on a white circle. but artillery fire landed on the hospital area regardless, both accidental and deliberate. The Luftwaffe battered these hospitals too, in multiple air raids, and the frequent bombing and shelling of the beachhead made for a constant sense of vulnerability. Some wounded troops felt safer in their foxholes on the front lines than they did in a hospital bed. When the army began to make noise about evacuating the nurses, removing them to somewhere safer, the women made even more noise back. They refused to go. One of Lieutenant Ainsworth's close friends and fellow nurse, Avis Shorer, later recounted those days in her book, A Half Acre of Hell. Their chief nurse, Mary Roberts, summarized the attitude to the Dallas Morning News. "You could say I was fearful but not scared." That distinction, fearful but not scared, is the entire story of Anzio in 7 words. Ellen Ainsworth had been born on March 9, 1919, and raised in Glenwood City, Wisconsin, a small farming community of about 1,000 people. She was the youngest of 3 children. After graduating from nursing school in Minneapolis in 1941, she joined the United States Army Nurse Corps in March 1942. By the time she reached Anzio in late January 1944, she had already spent nearly 2 years following the war across North Africa and up through Italy. She was 24 years old. Her hometown remembered her as a caring girl who loved to sing and had a beautiful voice. On the evening of February 10th, the hospital area came under heavy artillery bombardment. As some nurses rushed patients into nearby bunkers, some medical personnel remained in the tents to take care of those too injured to be moved. Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth chose to stay. What followed is recorded in her Silver Star citation, a document that is among the most plainly written and quietly devastating pieces of military prose you will ever read. Second Lieutenant Ainsworth was on duty in a hospital ward while the area was being subjected to heavy enemy artillery shelling. One shell dropped within a few feet of the ward, its fragments piercing the tent in numerous places. Despite the extreme danger, she calmly directed the placing of 42 surgical patients on the ground to lessen the danger of further injury. By her disregard for her own safety and her calm assurance, she instilled confidence in her assistants and her patients, thereby preventing serious panic and injury. 42 patients, on the ground, in a canvas tent, while shells fell. Then, as working by flashlight, because the electrical wires had been cut, she and her fellow nurses moved all 42 people to a safer location. She emerged from that night unharmed. 2 days later, she was not so lucky. On February 12th, at 1900 hours, the enemy unleashed the heaviest air raid over Anzio. It lasted 1.5 hours. One anti-personnel bomb landed in the officers' area, seriously wounding Second Lieutenant Ellen G. Ainsworth. Ainsworth had just gotten off duty and was in her tent when a German bomb exploded outside, striking her with shrapnel. She wasn't afraid of anything, said her friend and fellow nurse Avis Shorer. After 4 days, she succumbed to her injuries on February 16, 1944, at the age of 24. She is buried at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery and Memorial in Nettuno, in Italy, a few miles from the beachhead where she died. Her portrait hangs in the Pentagon. She was the only Wisconsin woman killed by enemy fire during World War II. She was not the only nurse killed at Anzio. The entire war saw 16 women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps killed directly from enemy fire. 6 of those deaths were at Anzio. 6 women, 1 beachhead, 4 months. Along with Ainsworth, nurses Elaine Rowe, Rita Rourke, and Mary Roberts received the Silver Star for their actions on the night of February 10th. They were among the first women in the history of the United States Army to receive that decoration, the third highest award for gallantry in combat specifically. According to the story of the 56th EVAC, published in 1945, Roberts was designated first by seniority of rank, making her the first American woman in U.S. and Army history to receive the Silver Star, a fact that belongs in every textbook about American women in the Second World War and appears in almost none of them. Think about that. The first women in U.S. Army history to receive the Silver Star did so for staying at their posts inside a shelled canvas hospital tent and moving patients to safety by flashlight. Their names are Ellen Ainsworth, Elaine Rowe, Rita Rourke, and Mary Roberts. How many of those names did you know before this video? Here is the detail that should make you angry. According to some historical accounts of the Anzio campaign, during February and March of 1944, the removal of nurses from the beachhead was seriously considered. The Army's official history states they were ultimately kept in place because they were desperately needed. There was no replacing them. But other accounts note a secondary calculation at work that evacuating the nurses would have sent an unmistakable signal to the combat troops that things were truly, perhaps irreversibly, desperate. Whatever the full weight of the reasoning, the Army's own records confirm the plan was considered and rejected, and the nurses themselves only learned of it after the fact, meeting the revelation with what can only be described as critical astonishment that such a plan was ever seriously entertained. Women who had refused evacuation on their own terms were being discussed in closed rooms as potential symbols to be managed. They didn't know. The hospital network at Anzio cared for more than 33,000 patients, including nearly 11,000 who suffered battle wounds. Dozens of patients, physicians, and medics were killed, including 6 Army nurses. Those 6 nurses died under canvas marked with red crosses, under a symbol that was supposed to mean, "This place is protected." The Geneva Conventions are not a suggestion. They are not a courtesy extended when convenient. The protection of medical personnel and facilities in war zones is among the oldest and most foundational principles of international humanitarian law, dating back to the original 1864 Geneva Convention, born from the horror of the Battle of Solferino, when a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant watched thousands of soldiers die untended on a battlefield and decided the world had to do better. The red cross on a white background is his symbol. It is the symbol of that commitment. The khaki hospital tents at Anzio were marked by enormous red crosses on a white circle. Artillery fire landed on them anyway, both accidental and deliberate. A message was sent to the German command giving the exact coordinates of the area containing the hospitals, hoping this would induce the enemy to refrain from further shelling. The shelling continued. Ellen Ainsworth knew what her armband meant. She had worn it across 2 continents. She knew the law. She knew the symbol. She chose to stay at her post in a place that was supposed to be protected, caring for patients who needed her, on the reasonable assumption that the protections she had been promised would hold. They did not hold, and when she died, when all 6 of them died, the country that had sent them there initially considered evacuating the rest, debating in the process whether those women's lives were expendable or essential, strategic or symbolic. And that is 2 separate failures. And both of them happen to women whose names most people do not know. Ellen Ainsworth was born on March 9th, 1919, and raised in Glenwood City, Wisconsin. She was the youngest of 3 children. She loved to sing. She organized Christmas carols for the troops. She graduated from nursing school, joined the Army Corps, followed the war across Morocco and Tunisia and Salerno and Anzio, And on the night of February 10th, 1944, she stayed in a tent full of surgical patients while artillery shells fell around her and moved 42 of them to safety by flashlight. 2 days later, a bomb fragment found her. 4 days after that, she was gone. A portrait of Second Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth hangs in the Pentagon. A residence hall at the Wisconsin Veterans Home in King, Wisconsin, and the American Legion post in her hometown are dedicated to her. She has a conference room at the Pentagon named after her. Her hometown still mourns her. And she was among the first women in the history of the United States Army to receive the Silver Star. She was 24 years old. Say her name. Say